In Black Pine National Forest, an ex-paramedic hiker was about to face something far worse than any trauma he'd seen in the ER. A routine trek with his loyal Labrador turned into a nightmare when the dog bolted into the undergrowth, digging frantically at the cold, damp soil. Daniel Tate wasn't just another weekend hiker. For 15 years he had been an emergency responder, trained to keep his hands steady even as lives slipped away. He'd seen the worst of humanity, the aftermath of violence, the fragility of life itself, but none of it had prepared him for what his dog unearthed. When Cooper's frantic paws revealed the first gleaming bone, Daniel assumed it was a tragic accident, a lost hiker, a forgotten grave. He was wrong. The ground itself felt wrong, too fresh, too disturbed, as if something had been buried alive. Recently, what began as a search for a runaway dog would become a descent into the heart of something ancient, something waiting beneath the forest floor. Black Pine would never be the same after what Daniel uncovered, and what uncovered him in return. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of pine and damp earth filled Daniel Tate's lungs as he adjusted his backpack straps. Something about the crisp mountain air eased the tightness that had lived in his chest for months now. 3 miles into the trail, and the weight had already begun to lift, the constant pressure of memory of failure, temporarily suspended in the cathedral of ancient trees. "Come on, Cooper," Daniel called over his shoulder. The chocolate Labrador bounded up behind him, tongue lolling, eyes bright with excitement. Unlike most of the pristine gear Daniel carried, Cooper was the one companion that showed signs of wear. A small notch in his left ear, the gray starting to frost his muzzle. 7 years together, and the dog remained the only living thing Daniel hadn't managed to disappoint. Daniel paused at a ridge overlooking the sprawling wilderness of Black Pine National Forest. Miles of undisturbed greenery stretched into blue-hazed mountains. No cell service, no people, just the way he liked it. "This is why we come out here, boy," he murmured, running his hand through Cooper's fur as the dog settled beside him. "No complications." Cooper nudged his hand with a cold nose but remained unusually quiet, his attention fixed on the distant tree line below. Daniel pulled his topographical map from his pocket, tracing their intended route with his finger. The familiar ritual was comforting, measuring distance, calculating time, predicting terrain, controllable variables, manageable outcomes. Nothing like the chaos of an emergency room, where sometimes, no matter how hard you tried. He folded the map quickly, pushing the thought away. That life was behind him now. "Just us and the trail," Daniel said firmly, shouldering his pack again. "Let's make the upper ridge before sundown." They continued along the marked path, Daniel's hiking boots finding easy purchase on the packed dirt. This was his 4th time in Black Pine, but he'd never ventured into the northern reaches where they were headed. The rangers had mentioned something about hikers avoiding that area, but Daniel hadn't paid much attention. People avoided wilderness for the stupidest reasons: mosquitoes, ghost stories, a little mud. As the afternoon deepened, the forest grew denser. Shafts of amber sunlight pierced the canopy at sharp angles, creating pockets of gold amid lengthening shadows. Daniel glanced at his watch. They had maybe 2 hours of good light left. "We'll find a clearing up ahead," he told Cooper, who had slowed his pace, nose working overtime against the ground. "Set up camp, get some food in us." The dog didn't respond, which wasn't like him. Cooper usually perked up at the mention of dinner. "Cooper?" The lab had stopped completely, his body rigid, ears forward. "What is it? Deer?" A low growl rumbled in Cooper's throat. Daniel frowned. Cooper wasn't an anxious dog. He'd seen bears, moose, even a mountain lion once, and handled them with a cautious respect, not fear. This was different. Cooper's hackles stood fully raised, his eyes fixed on something in the thick undergrowth to their left, away from the trail. "There's nothing there, boy," Daniel said, his voice steady despite a sudden unease creeping up his spine. "Come on." He took 3 steps forward before Cooper erupted into frantic barking, a high-pitched, urgent sound Daniel had never heard from him before. Before Daniel could react, Cooper bolted into the underbrush, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. "Cooper, goddammit, Cooper!" Daniel hesitated for only a second before plunging after him. Branches whipped at his face as he pushed through the thick vegetation, calling the dog's name. The carefully marked trail disappeared behind him, but Daniel wasn't concerned yet. His GPS watch would get them back. What worried him was Cooper's behavior. In 7 years, the dog had never disobeyed a direct command. The forest floor sloped downward sharply, and Daniel had to half slide, half run down the incline, grabbing at saplings to slow his descent. The trees grew more tightly packed here, old-growth giants with massive trunks and sprawling root systems that erupted from the earth like arthritic fingers. "Cooper." His voice sounded strange here, muffled, as if the forest swallowed the sound. 15 minutes into the pursuit, Daniel realized something odd. The normal sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustle of small animals, even the whisper of wind through leaves had all ceased. The silence hung thick as fog, broken only by his labored breathing and the distant, insistent barking of his dog. The terrain leveled out into a small hollow surrounded by towering pines. As Daniel entered the clearing, he stopped abruptly. In the center stood a large moss-covered rock, roughly the size of a small car. But it wasn't the rock itself that made Daniel's skin prickle with unease. It was the markings carved into its surface. They couldn't be natural, too precise, too intentional. Symbols he didn't recognize. Spiraling patterns, sharp angles, what might have been letters in some ancient alphabet. Daniel approached slowly, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. The carvings seemed to ripple in his vision, as if the stone itself were somehow fluid. He reached out a hand. Cooper's barking crescendoed from somewhere beyond the rock, shaking Daniel from his trance. He pulled his hand back quickly, suddenly reluctant to touch the stone's surface. "Cooper!" He circled around the rock and spotted a flash of brown fur further down the hollow. Daniel's unease deepened as he made his way toward the dog. This far-off trail in terrain he didn't know, with daylight fading, he was breaking every rule of wilderness safety he'd ever learned. But Cooper's barking had taken on a desperate quality that overrode Daniel's caution. He found the lab in a small depression beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient pine, digging frantically at the dark soil. His paws muddied to the joint. A spray of dirt flew behind him as he attacked the ground with single-minded determination. "Cooper, stop! What the hell has gotten into you?" Daniel reached for the dog's collar, but Cooper growled at him, something he had never done before. Then the lab returned to his digging with renewed vigor. Daniel stood back, watching his normally obedient companion with growing concern. Cooper's eyes had a wild quality, fixated on something Daniel couldn't perceive. The hollow was eerily still around them, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. "This is ridiculous," Daniel thought. "It's just a dog chasing a scent. Probably a buried squirrel or something." But as darkness began to gather between the trees, Daniel couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the shadowed forest. Nothing moved. Even the breeze had died completely, leaving the air unnaturally still. "Cooper, we need to head back," Daniel said, his voice sounding too loud in the silence. "Now." The dog ignored him, dirt flying from his increasingly deep hole. Daniel sighed, resigning himself to the situation. Clearly, Cooper wasn't going to stop until he found whatever had captured his attention so completely. Maybe once he satisfied his curiosity, they could return to the trail before darkness made navigation impossible. "Fine. Let me see what's got you so worked up." Daniel knelt beside the hole, the knees of his hiking pants sinking into the soft earth. Cooper had excavated a surprisingly deep pit in the short time he'd been digging. The soil here was unusually dark and damp, almost black in the fading light. "Move over, let me help," Daniel said, gently nudging Cooper aside. The dog reluctantly made space but remained tense, whining softly as Daniel began clearing away loose dirt with his hands. The soil felt wrong somehow, too cold, too moist for the relatively dry conditions they'd hiked through all day. Daniel's fingers worked methodically, scooping away clumps of dirt until they scraped against something solid. Not a root, not a rock, something smooth, long, curved. A chill ran through Daniel that had nothing to do with the falling temperature. He brushed away more soil, revealing what lay beneath. Gleaming white in the dwindling light, unmistakable in its shape. A human finger bone. Cooper whined, pawing at the edge of the hole as Daniel sat back on his heels, heart suddenly hammering in his chest. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. His paramedic's mind cataloged the discovery with clinical detachment. Phalanx, probably human, exposed to the elements long enough to be completely clean of tissue. An old gravesite, perhaps? Native American? Historical? But another part of his mind, the part that had felt the wrongness of this place from the moment Cooper bolted from the trail, whispered something else entirely. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong here. The unnatural silence, the strange rock with its unsettling carvings. And now this. Daniel should stop. He should cover this up, mark the location on his GPS and report it to the proper authorities once he was back in range. That would be the sensible thing, the right thing. Instead, he found himself digging deeper, his movements growing more urgent. Cooper joined him again, their hands and paws working in frantic tandem as if compelled by a force neither could resist nor understand. The light continued to fade, shadows thickening around them as they unearthed more of what lay buried in the cold black earth. The bone was just the beginning. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he brushed away more soil, revealing a second finger bone, then a third, still partially articulated. The fading light made it difficult to see clearly, forcing him to retrieve his headlamp from his pack. The harsh LED beam cut through the gathering darkness, throwing the excavation into stark relief. "This has to be old," Daniel muttered to himself, needing to hear a voice, even his own, in the unnatural silence. "Historical. Has to be." Cooper whined, circling the hole nervously now rather than digging. The dog's earlier frantic energy had given way to something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "It's okay, boy, just some old remains. Nothing to worry about." But as Daniel continued to dig, carefully now, his paramedic's training taking over, the reassurance rang hollow. The earth gave way to more bones, metacarpals, carpals, the beginnings of an ulna. All connected, all in the correct anatomical position, and all strangely clean for something that should have been buried for decades, if not centuries. Daniel's unease deepened as he uncovered more of the arm. The bones showed no signs of weathering or discoloration that would indicate long-term exposure to soil. If anything, they looked recent. "That's not possible," he said aloud, his voice tight. But his mind was already racing ahead, calculating decomposition rates, soil acidity, temperature factors, all the variables that affected how quickly a body broke down. He should stop, cover this up, mark it on his GPS and notify the authorities. Every rational instinct told him this was the right course of action. Instead, he kept digging. Night had fully descended now, the forest beyond his headlamp's beam an impenetrable wall of darkness. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by Cooper's occasional whimpers and the sound of his own increasingly labored breathing. Sweat beaded on Daniel's forehead despite the cooling air. His fingers, caked with black soil, worked mechanically, as if disconnected from his conscious mind. The excavation expanded, revealing a shoulder, a clavicle, the beginning of a rib cage. Daniel worked with grim determination, no longer questioning why he felt compelled to continue. Something in him needed to know, needed to see. His headlamp illuminated the first patch of tissue just as he reached the sternum. Leathery, dark, but unmistakably not bone. Daniel froze, his breath catching. "Jesus Christ," he whispered for the second time that evening. This was not an ancient burial. The body he was uncovering still had soft tissue attached. The chest cavity was mostly intact, though sunken and partially decomposed. The rate of decomposition suggested weeks, not years. Certainly not the decades or centuries he'd initially assumed. Daniel sat back on his heels, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Someone had died out here recently. Been buried. By whom? And why off-trail in such a remote area? A more pressing question surfaced in his mind. Was it an accident? Or was he digging up a murder victim? With newfound caution, Daniel continued excavating around the body, his paramedics training fully engaged now. The corpse was male, average build, probably mid-30s, though decomposition made precise aging difficult. He was dressed in what appeared to be hiking gear similar to Daniel's own, now rotted and fused with partially liquefied tissue in places. As Daniel uncovered the face, he had to look away momentarily. Death was no stranger to him. He'd seen plenty of it during his paramedic days, but this was different. More personal somehow. The facial features were distorted, the eyes sunken, the lips pulled back in a grimacing rictus. But what disturbed Daniel most was the expression frozen on that decomposing face. Pure terror. Cooper had retreated to the edge of Daniel's light, watching with unblinking eyes. He hadn't made a sound in several minutes. "What happened to you?" Daniel murmured, addressing the corpse. He methodically examined what he could see of the body, looking for an obvious cause of death. There were no visible gunshot wounds or stab injuries, no clear signs of blunt force trauma to the exposed skull. The clothing showed no significant tears or bloodstains that would indicate violence. But something wasn't right. The positioning was odd, the arms twisted at unnatural angles, the legs contorted beneath the torso. Not the careful arrangement of a proper burial, but not the random sprawl of someone who had simply died where they fell, either. It looked almost as if he was trying to claw his way out, Daniel whispered, the realization sending ice through his veins. The implications crashed down on him all at once. This person might have been buried alive, had struggled, had died in this makeshift grave alone in the darkness. Daniel scrambled backward, suddenly desperate to put distance between himself and the horrific discovery. His headlamp beam swung wildly as he moved, briefly illuminating the trees surrounding the hollow. He froze. In that momentary sweep of light, he'd caught something. Markings on the trunks of the trees circling the depression. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, directing his headlamp at the nearest pine. Carved into the bark, weathered but distinct, were symbols identical to those on the moss-covered rock he'd found earlier. Spirals, angular shapes, what might have been letters in an alphabet he couldn't identify. Daniel pivoted slowly, scanning the surrounding trees. Every trunk within the hollow bore similar markings, all facing inward, all oriented toward the grave he'd just opened. "What the hell is this?" His voice sounded thin and fragile in the oppressive silence. Cooper growled suddenly, a deep, rumbling sound that raised the hair on Daniel's arms. The dog was staring intently into the darkness beyond the hollow, his body rigid with tension. Daniel heard it then, a soft crunch of undergrowth. Footsteps moving slowly through the forest, coming closer. He whipped around, his headlamp slicing through the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" Nothing but trees, shadows, the endless black of the forest at night. The footsteps stopped. Daniel strained to hear, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears he feared it might obscure other sounds. For several long seconds there was nothing. Then, just as he began to wonder if he'd imagined it, the footsteps resumed. Still methodical, still approaching, but from a different direction now. "Who's there?" Daniel called again, his voice stronger this time, an edge of anger cutting through the fear. "Show yourself." Again the footsteps ceased at the sound of his voice. Again silence descended, heavier than before. Again, after an excruciating pause, they resumed, now from yet another direction. Whatever was out there was circling them. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. A ranger? Unlikely. They would have identified themselves. Another hiker? Possible. But who would be wandering off trail in this remote area after dark? A predator? Bear? Mountain lion? None of those options explained the footsteps that sounded human yet behaved wrong. Cooper's growl intensified, his focus shifting, as whatever circled them changed position again. The dog backed up until he was pressed against Daniel's legs, no longer the confident hunting companion but a creature seeking protection. Daniel fumbled for his pack, fingers closing around the reassuring shape of his hunting knife. The 6-inch blade seemed woefully inadequate against the darkness and what might be lurking within it, but its weight in his hand steadied him. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly to Cooper, trying to keep his voice even. Back to the trail. The rational part of his mind, the part that had once calmly inserted IVs during multi-car pileups and maintained clear airways in coding patients, assessed their options with clinical detachment. They were off-trail in unfamiliar territory. Night had fully fallen. His only navigation tools were his GPS watch, compass, and map. Using these effectively would require light, which would make them more visible to whatever was out there. More pressingly, he'd just uncovered what appeared to be a homicide victim. He had a legal and moral obligation to report it, but his phone showed no service as expected. His emergency satellite communicator was back in his tent, set up at the campsite they'd never reached. Daniel faced an impossible choice. Remain with the body until daylight, then try to find his way back to the trail and seek help, or leave immediately, marking the location for authorities, and get himself and Cooper to safety. The sound of footsteps resumed, closer now. Daniel's headlamp caught a flicker of movement between the trees. Nothing distinct, just a shadow shifting where no shadow should move. Cooper's growl transformed into frantic barking, his focus locked on the forest's edge. Daniel raised his knife, his back to the open grave, his eyes straining to penetrate the darkness. "Stay back," he shouted, the command equal parts warning and desperate plea. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The forest fell silent again, not even the whisper of wind disturbing the unnatural stillness. For a moment, Daniel thought whatever had been stalking them had retreated. Then he felt it. A cold breath against the back of his neck, raising goosebumps along his spine. Not from the direction Cooper was facing, but from behind him. From the grave. Daniel spun around, knife raised, headlamp illuminating the excavated corpse. Nothing had changed. The body lay exactly as he had uncovered it, half emerged from the earth, frozen in its final struggle. But something was different. Something in the air, a tension, a presence. A voice whispered directly into his ear, so close he could feel the phantom sensation of lips brushing against his skin. "You shouldn't have dug," it said, the words barely audible yet perfectly clear. "Now it knows your name." Daniel lurched backward, a strangled cry escaping his throat. Cooper's barking reached a frenzied pitch. The dog lunged forward, snapping at the air around the grave, though there was nothing visible to attack. The footsteps resumed, no longer trying to be stealthy. Multiple sets now, circling faster, closing in. Shadows moved between the trees, darting just beyond the reach of Daniel's light. His paralysis broke. Survival instinct overcame shock and fear. "Cooper, come." Daniel snatched up his backpack with one hand, keeping the knife ready in the other. "We're leaving now." The Labrador didn't need to be told twice. Together they bolted from the hollow, Daniel's headlamp bobbing wildly as they crashed through the underbrush. Behind them, the footsteps multiplied, accelerated, pursuing. Daniel had no plan beyond putting distance between themselves and the grave. His GPS watch showed their position, but in the panic of flight, navigation was secondary to speed. They plunged deeper into the forest, away from the hollow, away from the trail, away from the relative safety of known terrain. Cooper led the way, his superior night vision and sense of smell guiding them through the dense woods. The dog seemed to have a destination in mind, moving with purpose rather than blind panic. Daniel followed, trusting the animal's instincts more than his own in this moment. The sounds of pursuit faded somewhat as they ran, but never disappeared entirely. Always there, just behind them, keeping pace, waiting. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 frantic minutes, Cooper slowed, then stopped at the edge of a small clearing. Daniel bent double, gasping for breath, his legs burning from the exertion. His headlamp revealed a small structure ahead, an old cabin, weathered and listing slightly, its windows dark. Another shelter from the darkness, another chance to regroup, another place to hide. But as Daniel straightened, preparing to approach the cabin, the whisper came again. Not from behind this time, but from all around, as if the forest itself were speaking. "Daniel," it said, his name drawn out into a sibilant hiss. "We've been waiting for you." And Daniel knew with absolute certainty that he and Cooper were not alone in these woods, that they had never been alone, that whatever watched them, whatever pursued them, knew exactly who they were, and it had only just begun to hunt. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The whisper of his name hung in the air like frost, each syllable precise and knowing. The distant cabin beckoned, a promise of shelter, but suddenly it seemed more trap than sanctuary. "Come on," he whispered to Cooper, his voice barely audible. The dog pressed against his leg, trembling but alert, waiting for guidance. Daniel fought to control his racing thoughts. He needed a plan. They couldn't keep running blindly through the forest. At some point, they had to reorient themselves, find their way back to the trail, to safety. "We'll circle around," he decided, giving Cooper's head a reassuring pat. "Get our bearings, then make for the main trail." The night pressed in around them, their small bubble of light from Daniel's headlamp the only reprieve from the absolute darkness. He reached for his pack, retrieving his compass. The reliable instrument had guided him through countless wilderness excursions. It would show them the way back, but as Daniel held the compass in his palm, the needle spun wildly, rotating in continuous circles without settling on any direction. He tapped the case, then shook it gently. Nothing changed. The needle continued its frantic rotation, as if the magnetic poles themselves had vanished. "That's not possible," he muttered, staring at the malfunctioning instrument. He pulled out his GPS watch, hoping for better results. The display showed their coordinates, but no map data, just a blank field with 2 digits that didn't correspond to any navigation system Daniel recognized. As he watched, the numbers began shifting randomly, flickering like a dying light. A cold weight settled in Daniel's stomach. Without reliable navigation tools, finding their way back to the trail would be nearly impossible in this darkness. They could end up walking in circles until daybreak, or worse, venturing even deeper into the unknown terrain. "We need to wait for morning," he said quietly to Cooper. "Maybe the electronics will sort themselves out by then." The dog whined softly, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Daniel turned back toward the clearing. With the cabin, his decision made. Shelter for the night, then navigation at first light. But as he attempted to retrace their steps, something seemed wrong. The forest no longer looked familiar, even accounting for the darkness and their frantic flight. The trees stood closer together than he remembered, their trunks twisted at odd angles. The underbrush seemed thicker, more tangled. Even the ground beneath his feet felt different, spongier, less stable. "This is the way we came," Daniel insisted, more to convince himself than Cooper. "I'm sure of it." But he wasn't sure. Not at all. With each step, the forest grew increasingly alien. The normal nighttime sounds of the wilderness, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through leaves, were eerily absent. The silence was absolute, broken only by their footfalls and Daniel's increasingly labored breathing. No, not quite absolute. There was something else, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. Not his, not Cooper's. Something else, keeping pace, just beyond the reach of his light. Daniel froze, straining to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding them completely. Cooper's hackles rose, a silent snarl curling his lips. But the dog made no sound. His silence was somehow more terrifying than any growl or bark would have been. "Hello?" Daniel called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. His voice sounded wrong, flat and muffled, as if the forest absorbed the sound before it could travel. No response came, just that steady, patient breathing. "We're armed," he lied, gripping his hunting knife more tightly. Best to stay back. Still nothing. The breathing continued, unhurried, untroubled by his warning. Daniel forced himself to move again, choosing a direction at random, hoping it would lead them somewhere, anywhere, away from that persistent sound. Cooper followed closely, his body tense but obedient. As they moved through the distorted landscape, Daniel became aware of movement at the corners of his vision, darting shadows that vanished when he turned his head, forms that seemed to flow between the trees like smoke. Never quite visible, never fully formed but undeniably present. "It's just stress," he muttered, the rational part of his mind desperately trying to explain away what he was experiencing. Sleep deprivation, low blood sugar. Maybe we stirred up some spores when we were digging, some kind of hallucinogenic fungus. But no explanation could account for the way the forest itself seemed to shift around them, paths appearing and disappearing, distances stretching and contracting in impossible ways. Twice they found themselves back at the same twisted oak despite walking in what Daniel was certain was a straight line. Cooper had gone utterly still now, no longer even whining. The lab moved like a ghost beside Daniel, each step carefully, placed, his usual exuberance replaced by a primal caution that spoke of ancient instincts awakened. It was during one of their silent traverses through yet another unfamiliar stretch of woods that Daniel first noticed the markings. Almost hidden in the darkness, carved freshly into the bark of a pine tree, the same symbols he'd seen on the moss-covered rock, on the trees surrounding the grave. But these couldn't have been here before. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood, still oozing sap that glistened in his headlamp's beam. Daniel approached the tree slowly, running his fingers over the strange markings. The carved lines were perfectly smooth, as if cut with surgical precision rather than a knife or tool. "Who's doing this?" he whispered, turning in a slow circle. His light revealed more symbols on surrounding trees, each set freshly carved, each facing directly toward him no matter which way he turned. It was as if they had appeared in the instant before his light found them, multiplying in the darkness just beyond his sight. Daniel backed away, bumping into another tree trunk. When he spun around, his light revealed yet more symbols carved into that bark as well, symbols that hadn't been there seconds before. "This isn't real," he said, his voice cracking. "This can't be real." Cooper pressed against his leg, trembling now, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The dog could sense it too. Whatever it was. The wrongness. The impossible geography. The feeling of being watched by countless unseen eyes. Daniel's training as a paramedic had taught him to trust observable facts, to follow protocols, to maintain calm in crisis. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. A forest that seemed to breathe and move with conscious intent, that rearranged itself around them, that carved messages in its own flesh. Yet amid the rising panic, a strange clarity began to emerge. If his instruments couldn't guide them, if his senses couldn't be trusted, then perhaps Cooper could. The dog had led them away from immediate danger before. Maybe animal instinct would succeed where human reason failed. "Where do we go, boy?" Daniel asked softly, kneeling beside the lab. "Show me." Cooper's eyes locked with his, a momentary connection that transcended their usual bond. Then the dog turned, pointing, his body toward a narrow gap between two twisted pines. Not the direction of the cabin they'd spotted earlier, but somewhere new. "All right," Daniel nodded, straightening. "I trust you." They moved forward together, Daniel surrendering to Cooper's guidance. The path the dog chose seemed to wind erratically through the forest, doubling back in places, making sharp turns. In others. Several times Cooper froze suddenly, waiting as something unseen passed nearby, before resuming their journey. The breathing sound followed them, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never entirely gone. Occasionally it was joined by other sounds, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves with no wind to move them, and once, a low, guttural sound that might have been a laugh. As they continued their strange, circuitous route, Daniel became aware of subtle changes in the forest. The trees were thinning slightly. The undergrowth was less tangled. The ground felt firmer beneath his feet. Cooper's pace quickened, his movements more purposeful. "Are we getting somewhere?" Daniel asked, hope flaring briefly. The dog didn't respond, intent on whatever path he was following. But there was definitely a change in the terrain. They were ascending now, climbing a gentle slope that Daniel couldn't remember from their earlier flight. The breathing sound faded somewhat as they climbed, though Daniel couldn't shake the certainty that they were still being watched. The shadows still moved at the edges of his vision, but they seemed less immediate, as if reluctant to follow them up the slope. Cooper led them through a dense thicket of young pines, their branches scratching at Daniel's face and arms as he pushed through. On the other side, the trees opened up into a small clearing bathed in pale moonlight. Daniel switched off his headlamp, allowing his eyes to adjust to the natural illumination. The clearing was roughly circular, ringed by towering pines. At its center stood a flat, table-like rock, its surface bare except for a thin layer of moss. Unlike the oppressive darkness of the forest, this space felt not safe exactly, but less hostile. The air moved here, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth rather than the stagnant, rotting odor that had permeated the woods below. "Good boy," Daniel said, genuine relief in his voice as he gave Cooper an appreciative pat. "This is better." The dog wasn't celebrating their arrival, however. He moved cautiously into the clearing, sniffing the air, his body still tense with alertness. The moonlight revealed patches of gray around his muzzle that Daniel hadn't noticed. Before making him look older, wearier, Daniel circled the stone table, considering their options. The elevated position might help him get his bearings once daylight came. The clearing offered visibility that the dense forest lacked. They could rest here, perhaps. Wait for morning. As he completed his circuit of the stone, his foot struck something half buried in the soft earth. Kneeling, Daniel brushed away soil to reveal a metal object, an old-fashioned lantern, rusted but intact. Beside it lay a small leather-bound book, its cover warped by exposure to the elements. Daniel picked up both items, bringing them to the stone table. The lantern was empty of fuel, useless. But the book. He opened it carefully, the binding crackling with age. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, much of it faded to near illegibility. Dates were marked at the top of each entry, the most recent from nearly 7 years ago. April 17. It's watching me again tonight, standing just beyond the trees, never moving, never blinking. I've started to wonder if it's even alive in the conventional sense. Maybe it's something else entirely. Something older. God help me. I think it's getting closer. April 18. The symbols are spreading. They're on every tree around my camp now. I've tried to document them, but they change when I'm not looking, like they're communicating or transforming. I don't think I was meant to see them. April 19th. Found another body today. That makes 3. All partially buried. All with the same expression. They were trying to dig themselves out. What buries people alive out here? And why do they all look like they've seen something beyond horror at the moment of death? April 20. It spoke my name tonight. My full name. I never told anyone out here my middle name. No one alive knows it's Eugene. I'm leaving at first light. The trail can't be more than 5 miles east. I'll make a run for it. If anyone finds this, stay away from Black Pine. The forest is wrong. The final entry ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. The remaining pages were blank, save for dark stains that Daniel tried very hard not to identify as dried blood. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He closed the book with trembling hands, suddenly aware of how exposed they were in the moonlit clearing. The breathing sound had stopped completely, but that was somehow worse. The sense of being watched had intensified, focused, like the attention of a predator fixating on its prey. Cooper growled, low and threatening, facing the eastern edge of the clearing. Daniel followed his gaze, squinting into the shadows between the trees. At first he saw nothing, just darkness, the black spaces between trunks. Then a subtle movement caught his eye, a shifting of shadow within shadow, a form taking shape, too tall to be human, too still to be natural. Daniel reached for his knife, though he knew instinctively it would be useless against whatever stood watching them from the tree line. Cooper's growl deepened, but the dog made no move to attack or flee. They were trapped in a standoff, frozen in this moonlit clearing while something ancient and patient observed them from the darkness. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel backed toward the opposite side of the clearing, urging Cooper to follow. The watching presence made no move to pursue, but Daniel could feel its attention tracking them, unwavering, unblinking. As they reached the western edge of the clearing, a gap in the trees revealed a steep slope leading downward. And there, nestled among the pines perhaps half a mile below, a structure caught the moonlight. The cabin they'd glimpsed earlier. From this vantage point it looked weathered but solid, a man-made intrusion in the wilderness. Smoke rose from its chimney, a thin gray line against the night sky. Someone was there. Someone alive. Daniel glanced back at the eastern tree line. The shadow figure remained motionless, watching, waiting. "Come on," he whispered to Cooper, choosing the path of potential help over the unknown terror behind them. Together, they began their descent toward the cabin, leaving the moonlit clearing and plunging once more into the darkness of the forest. But as the trees closed around them, Daniel couldn't shake the certainty that they were heading exactly where the Watcher wanted them to go. And that knowledge was somehow more terrifying than anything else he'd experienced in these twisted woods. The descent to the cabin seemed to take both forever and no time at all. The forest played with perspective, distances expanding and contracting in ways that defied logic. One moment the structure appeared miles away. The next, it loomed directly ahead, as if it had leapt forward to meet them. Daniel paused at the edge of a small clearing surrounding the cabin. From a distance, the plume of smoke had suggested occupation, the promise of another human presence. Up close, the reality was less certain. The structure stood dark and silent, the smoke from the chimney now just a wispy ghost against the night sky. "Hello?" Daniel called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Anyone there?" No response came. Cooper pressed against his leg, unusually hesitant. The cabin was simple, a single-story structure built of rough-hewn logs darkened by age and weather. A small porch sagged across the front, leading to a door that hung slightly ajar. One window flanked the entrance, its glass cloudy and cracked. The roof appeared mostly intact, though patches of newer wood suggested recent repairs. "Stay close," Daniel whispered to Cooper as they approached. The porch steps creaked beneath his weight, the sound jarringly loud in the stillness. Daniel hesitated at the threshold, listening for any movement inside. Nothing. Just that same heavy silence that had followed them through the forest. He pushed the door open wider with the tip of his boot, hinges protesting. His headlamp beam cut through the darkness, revealing the cabin's interior, a single room sparsely furnished. "Hello?" he called again, softer now. When no answer came, Daniel stepped inside, Cooper following reluctantly. The dog's nose worked overtime, sampling the air with clear unease. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and something else, a sour note of fear sweat and neglect. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its fire reduced to glowing embers that explained the dwindling smoke. A narrow cot stood against the opposite wall, blankets rumpled as if recently vacated. A rough wooden table occupied the center of the room, cluttered with papers, canned goods, and what appeared to be a half-eaten meal. Daniel approached the table, examining the abandoned food. A tin plate held congealing stew, a spoon still, stuck upright in the mess as if the diner had fled mid-bite. Beside it sat an open can of beans, a hunting knife, and a battered metal mug containing coffee gone cold. Whatever had driven the cabin's occupant away had come suddenly, unexpectedly. Someone left in a hurry, Daniel murmured, reaching toward the coffee mug. He stopped when his fingers were inches away, noticing the thin film of dust on the liquid's surface. Not hours old. Days. Yet the embers in the stove still glowed. An involuntary shiver ran through him. Someone, or something, had been tending that fire. Recently. Cooper whined softly, drawing Daniel's attention to a corner where a rusted rifle leaned against the wall. He moved toward it quickly, hope flaring. A weapon. Real protection, not just his hunting knife. His hope died as soon as he lifted the gun. The stock was cracked, the barrel bent slightly. Worse, the firing mechanism was completely missing, rendering it useless. It was a prop, nothing more. The illusion of protection without substance. Daniel set it down, frustration mounting. He turned his attention to the papers scattered across the table. Maps mostly, detailed topographical, charts of the Black Pine region, far more comprehensive than Daniel's own. Red X marks dotted the wilderness areas, clustered around the northern sector where they now found themselves. Handwritten notes crowded the margins, the same cramped script he'd seen in the journal from the clearing. One phrase appeared repeatedly, circled and underlined with increasing urgency. Don't disturb the ground. A chill ran through Daniel as he recalled the grave they'd uncovered, Cooper's frantic digging. The whisper in the darkness. Now it knows your name. He shuffled through more papers, finding weather logs, supply inventories, and what appeared to be a makeshift calendar with days crossed off. The most recent date marked was nearly 2 weeks ago. Beneath the scattered documents lay a leather-bound book similar to the one he'd found in the clearing, but newer. Its pages less weathered. Daniel opened it, revealing a journal filled with the same handwriting. The earlier entries were methodical, almost scientific. Observations of weather patterns, wildlife sightings, notes on edible plants and water sources. The work of an experienced outdoorsman documenting his environment. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. March 3rd. Heard the voices again last night. Always just beyond the tree line. Always when the moon is dark. I know what the locals say about these woods, but I've been a ranger for 20 years. There's always a logical explanation. Wind through rock formations. The calls of unknown animal species. Nothing supernatural. March 10th. Found unusual markings on trees near the North Ridge. Not bear claw marks. Too precise. Almost like writing, but in no language I recognize. Photographed several samples. Will check with university contacts when I return to town. March 15th. My camera is empty. All photos gone, though I distinctly remember taking them. Memory card completely erased. Attempted to sketch the markings instead. But my drawings don't match what I see on the trees. It's as if they change when I look away. March 18th. Discovered remains today. Human. Adult. Male. Partially buried in soft earth near the old stone circle. Called it in on the radio but only got static. We'll hike out tomorrow to notify authorities properly. March 19th. Can't find the trail. Any trail. Compass spinning wildly. GPS malfunctioning. The forest looks wrong somehow. Trees where there shouldn't be trees. Landmarks missing or moved. I've worked these woods for 2 decades. This is impossible. March 23. It's watching me. Standing just beyond the firelight. Tall. Too tall. Wrong proportions. I don't look directly at it anymore. That makes it come closer. The entries grew increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating. Whole pages were filled with descriptions of the watcher, detailed with the clinical precision of a naturalist observing a new species, alternating with passages of rambling paranoia. April 2nd. Trapped. Can't leave. The trails loop back. The river flows uphill. The sun rises in the west. Time stretches, contracts. Yesterday lasted 36 hours. Its lips moved, forming words without sound. I am the observer. I am the observed. I am the pattern that continues, the cycle that completes, the transformation that evolves. Daniel felt something shift within him, not a physical sensation, but a cognitive one, as if his perception had been subtly altered, enabling him to see aspects of reality previously hidden. The symbols that had marked his arms were visible again, not on his skin but somehow within it. Patterns flowing beneath the surface like living tattoos composed of shadow rather than ink. Kate gasped beside him, clearly experiencing a similar transformation. Cooper whined, backing away from both of them as if sensing the fundamental change occurring. "We've been changed," Daniel stated, the obvious truth finally acknowledged. Since the first moment in the forest, maybe since before that, everything since has just been the change manifesting. Kate nodded slowly, watching the patterns flow beneath her own skin with horrified fascination. The forest never needed to keep us there, she realized, echoing Daniel's earlier conclusion, because we would bring it out with us. Daniel turned away from the mirror, breathing hard, trying to process the cosmic horror of their situation, the complete collapse of boundaries between observer and observed, between human and other, between consciousness and pattern. Then he heard it, his own voice whispering from the reflection behind him. "Dig." He turned back slowly, finding his reflection leaning forward, hands pressed against the glass from within, face eager. With anticipation, "Dig," it repeated, the word forming in Daniel's mind rather than his ears. Unearth what waits, complete the pattern, continue the cycle, spread the transformation. And in that moment, Daniel understood his purpose. Not as victim, but as vector, not as prey, but as carrier, not as end, but as means. The forest had never been the destination. It had always been the beginning. The gateway had never been closed because it had never been solely physical. It existed within minds, within perception, within the very fabric of consciousness itself. And now it existed within him, within Kate, within everyone they would encounter. The transformation would spread, the influence would grow, the boundary between worlds would continue thinning until the distinction itself became meaningless. Daniel met his reflection's eager gaze, feeling something fundamental shifting within his mind. Resistance giving way to acceptance, horror transforming into understanding, human perception evolving into something older, deeper, more connected, to patterns beyond individual consciousness. The final truth settled into his bones. There had never been any escape because escape had never been the point. The cycle didn't end. It evolved. And he would be its instrument. "Dig," whispered his reflection one final time. Daniel nodded. Decision made. Purpose accepted. He turned to Kate, seeing in her eyes the same terrible understanding, the same inevitable acceptance. Cooper whined from the doorway, the last purely natural thing in a world rapidly transforming around them. The dog's loyalty warred visibly with instinctual fear of what his humans were becoming. "It's time to go back to the forest," Daniel said simply. Kate didn't argue, couldn't argue. The transformation within them had progressed too far for resistance to have meaning. They moved toward the apartment door, toward the forest clearing that waited beyond, toward the continuation of a cycle older than humanity itself. Cooper hesitated, torn between following his humans and fleeing what they had become. Daniel paused, looking back at the loyal animal that had guided him through so much. "It's okay, boy," he said gently. "You don't have to come this time." The dog whined again, conflict evident in his posture, in his eyes. Then, with visible reluctance, he moved to Daniel's side, loyalty ultimately overriding fear, connection overriding self-preservation. Daniel placed a hand on Cooper's head, feeling the symbols beneath his skin pulse in rhythm with something vast and ancient that now flowed through him, through Kate, through the very fabric of reality around them. They stepped through the door, together, into the forest, into the pattern, into the cycle that never truly ended. Behind them, in the abandoned apartment, the mirrors emptied of reflections. The shadows thinned to ordinary absence of light. The wrongness retreated, no longer needed now that its purpose had been fulfilled, its carriers had been created, its influence had been ensured. The transformation continued. The pattern advanced. And somewhere in Black Pine Forest, Daniel began to dig. The end. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.